This video is about performing layout management in Java's Swing library. So many programming languages allow you to set the position of graphical components in a window by specifying the exact coordinates that each component should be positioned at in the window. You would specify an XY offset from the corner of the window, and the component would position itself there. You'd also specify some sort of width and height for each component to describe how large the component should be. That's probably the most common way of laying out the different components in a window in most programming languages. However, that's not what Java does. Java uses a different strategy called layout managers. A layout manager is an object that is used to govern the position of all the other components on the screen. And it uses some sort of criteria to decide how to do that. And there's different kind of layout managers that do this task in different ways. And this is a little bit unusual. We have to learn about it to understand how it works. I think absolute positioning is a little bit more intuitive for most people. The benefit of the layout managers is that in different operating systems, different environments, you might have different font sizes and different shapes for your buttons and your text fields and this sort of thing. And Java will handle that situation more gracefully than some of these other programming languages, because if you specify everything using exact pixel coordinates, you'll find that an application that might look good on a Windows computer might look strange on a Mac or a Linux computer or something like that. So a layout manager is going to try to help us to make this more general so it will look better in all different circumstances. To understand the motivation for layout managers, let's look at a program. This program, we're just going to provide some code to start with here. If you watched the GUI basics video, you'll recognize a lot of this code. Basically, we're creating a frame, and we're setting its size, and now we're going to add some components inside that frame. We've created 3 buttons and 2 labels, and we're just going to put all those in the frame and then set the frame to be visible on the screen. So if we compile that and run that program, we'll see that we only see the label 2 showing up on the screen. And the reason we only see the label 2 is because we have not told the frame how to do its layout yet. And if you don't tell a frame how to do its layout, the default is that each component you add is given the entire frame as its space to operate. So technically speaking, all 5 of these components are stacked on top of each other, and the only one we're able to see is the one that's called label 2, because that's the last one we added. So that's no good. We have to learn a little bit more about these layout managers to fix this problem. So here is a diagram of some of the most popular layout managers that you can use in Java, and the window represents the way that the components would lay themselves out if you chose that layout manager. And so we'll go through each one of these in more detail, but you might get some idea just from looking at this summary diagram here of kind of how the different layouts will help you make different kinds of windows. The first one we're going to look at is called a flow layout. A flow layout is a layout that you can use to position things from left to right. And if you position things from left to right, you'll get sort of a long running flow like words in a paragraph. So the way that we tell Java how we want to lay out our components is we construct one of these layout manager objects, and we set that to be the layout of our frame. So we'll say something like frame dot set layout to be a new flow layout. And now, by using that flow layout, all 5 of these components will be added using this object to govern their positions and their resizing behavior. If I run this code again, now I see that we have these buttons followed by these labels. And the reason they look that way is because the flow layout tries to lay out everything left to right, but if it runs out of space, it wraps around to the next line. So you'll see if I run out of space for label 2, it wraps around like that. So that's a flow layout. And that works out fairly well. Depending on what kind of program we're writing, that can be a nice flexible layout for us to use. And there are some other ones we'll come back to in a moment. First, let's back up and talk about these layout managers in general and how they work and what's going on here. So there's an important concept called a container. A frame can act as a container. A container is an object that stores components inside of it. And a container has the following methods. You can add or remove a component. This type called component here is a superclass of all the other Java components like JButton or JLabel, that sort of thing. A container also has this method called setLayout, where you can pass a layout manager as a parameter. FlowLayout is a class that implements that layout manager interface. So JFrames act as containers. There's another class called JPanel that acts as a container as well. And so if you want, you can create a panel. A panel is basically a component that has no appearance, and the only purpose that it has is to store other components and lay them out. So an example might be, if we go back to our code here, if we have these 3 buttons, let's add one more. Let's say that we have 4 buttons here, button 1 through button 4. And we want these 4 buttons to be in a grid, but we want everything else to be in a flow. We could do something like this. We could say we want a JPanel, that is a new JPanel, and we could put some sort of layout in here for these buttons. So another kind of layout that we haven't seen yet is called grid layout. A grid layout takes a parameter for a number of rows and a number of columns, and then it lays out your components in a grid in that many rows and columns of equal size. And we can use that to lay out our buttons in a grid. So for example, if we go back to the code here, we could say this panel is going to have a new grid layout of 2 by 2. And now, instead of adding the buttons to the frame, we could add them to the panel. We could say panel.add button 1 and all the way through to button 4. And now, when we're adding everything to the frame, instead of adding button 1, 2, and 3, let's add the panel. And then we'll continue to add the label 1 and the label 2. Maybe I'll cut the label 1 and paste it above the panel. So if I compile that and run that, what I should see is, I should see the labels and a grid of buttons. So now the overall frame is laying everything out in a flow, but the 3 things that it's flowing together are a label, a grid of buttons in a panel, and another label. So that's an example of me using a grid inside of the overall flow for the frame. So let's look at some more layout managers. Another one is called border layout. The border layout is where you specify 5 different regions of the frame or the container, and you can put things in the north region, the west, the east, the center, or the south. And each region has different rules about how it works. The north and south regions will stretch any component stored in them to be as wide as the window. And the east and the west will stretch them to be as tall as the window, and the center gets all the remaining space. And so technically the frame is using a border layout. When you add things to a border layout, by default they go into the center, so that means they stretch to fill the entire space of the frame. And so actually, if you really want these components to be stored in a certain place, the way that you do that is you can tell your frame that you want to lay out like a border layout, and you can say, well, I want to add this label to the west. The way you add things to a different region is you can say border layout dot west or border layout dot east or something like that, and then this panel here can be in the border layout center. So you can pass this second parameter when you're adding things to a container. And if I run that, what I will see is that the labels are now in the west and the east like I asked for, and the buttons are in the center. You might notice that the buttons have gotten really large, and the reason the buttons have gotten really large is because the border layout will stretch whatever's stored in its container in its various regions. So that's why these buttons are growing. And if you don't want the buttons to grow, if you want them in the center but you want them to stay at their default size, there's also a way to accomplish that. But that would be a little bit trickier. We'd have to come back to that later. Anyway, that's the way to use a border layout. So right now we've got a grid inside of a border for the overall frame. There are a few other layouts. There's one called box layout that's most useful for creating a vertical stacking of components like you see in the picture here. We're not going to use that in our example today. There are a couple other ones called card layout, grid bag layout. There are more layouts out there. The card layout allows you to stack different components on top of each other, and the grid bag layout is very complicated. It allows you to lay out lots and lots of different components to get exactly the appearance you want. However, it's really complicated, and we don't recommend that you use it. If you actually want a complicated layout, there's another strategy that we can use called a composite layout. So imagine that we're trying to recreate this window in the screenshot here. None of the built-in layout managers will achieve quite this appearance. You know, you're seeing words here like southwest and southeast, but the border layout doesn't have a southwest region. There's just north, south, east, west, and center. And so you might wonder, how do we get something down in that corner there? Well, the way that you can do it is to create several different panels and give each panel a layout that helps you to solve the overall problem. So let me give you an example. These two buttons up here, those both look like they're sort of in the north area of the overall window. So let's try that out for a second. Let's try to add these guys to the north, and then this center button looks like he's in the center, and this southwest and southeast, they look like they're in the south. So let's try that. I'm going to throw away some of this for a second here. We don't need button 4 anymore. And let me throw away this panel that we were playing with. So let's make it so that let's match the appearance on the screen. So this says center button instead of button 3. So let's write center button for the third button. And these labels, I think, are supposed to say southwest and southeast. So now if we set the frame to have a border layout, we said that these two guys were kind of up in the north. So what if we say that we're going to add button 1 to the north, and we're going to add button 2 to the north, and then we said that this third center button, that was kind of in the center of the frame, and then in the south part we said we were going to add these two labels, label 1 and label 2, both in the south. So let's try that out. If we compile that and run that, what we'll see is that we do have a big center button, and we only see button 2 up here. We only see southeast down here. And the reason we see only one of the two things for each of the top and the bottom here is because you can't add two things to the north. You can't add two things to the south. It only lets you put one thing in each of these regions. So you might say, how do I get two buttons up here? Well, the answer is you don't add the two buttons here. You add a panel up here. And so here's what we do. We'll make a panel called North Panel or something like that, and we'll make a J panel, and we'll give it a layout that we think will recreate this appearance here. If you have button 1 and 2 just kind of left to right like that, that's a good example of a flow layout. And in that North Panel, we will add the button 1 and the button 2. Now when we're doing the overall frame, we're going to add the North Panel to the north, not the individual buttons. So by making that change, what I'll see is that now button 1 and button 2 both show up there. And this thing around them, this kind of empty space, that's the rest of the north panel. If you ever want to see which panels are where on the screen, you can do things like north panel.set background color.red as just a debugging technique. You can set background colors on different things. There's the north panel. It's all that empty space is the north panel there. That can just help you see what components and what containers are being put where on the screen. I'm going to turn that off again for now. But the other thing was, in the bottom of the window, we wanted the southwest label and the southeast label. We can't put both of those down there at the same time. So again, we could use a panel. So you might say, well, let's follow this same kind of model we did here. So let's, make a south panel. And we'll kind of mirror the structure that we use with the north panel, except instead of the buttons, we'll add label 1 and label 2. And so you might say that in the south here, we'll add the south panel to the south part of the overall frame instead of adding the two labels individually. If I run this, you will see the southwest and the southeast. However, in the screenshot, the southwest is all the way over here in the corner, and the southeast is all the way over here in the corner. Flow layout doesn't really push things over to the corners. It just lets them line up naturally in a column, in columns. So I think if we want them over in these corners, what we want to do is, for the south panel, instead of using a flow layout here, we will use a border layout, and we'll add this label to the west of that border layout, and we'll add the second label to the east of that border layout. So we talked about the overall frame having a border layout, but each of these panels can also have a border layout. So let's try that and see what that looks like. So here we go. Now with our north panel up here with these two buttons, and our south panel down here with these two labels, and our center button added directly to the center, we've recreated the appearance of the screenshot on the slide.